Hello, and welcome to what I'm hoping is going to be a very relaxed and very calm drawing session where I draw a foresty background landscape kind of thing. This is not my usual thing. I don't really do elaborate backgrounds all that much, but I felt very inspired by this picture of the little fox Kit. So I wanted to draw him in his natural habitat. So I start out just kind of sketching the trees and the forest. And, originally I wanted this little fox dude to be just peeking out from the underbrush, but I don't know how to do that. But I do kind of know how to do trees and how to do a river and how to do the land around a river because I used to watercolor with my grandmother, and one of the first pieces I ever did that I really, really enjoyed was a lake. So I know kind of how the edge of a riverbed looks, and I've done a couple pieces that involve trees and branches, so I knew kind of a little bit where this was going. But I'm not a huge fan of backgrounds usually because I feel like they're kind of boring. I actually did have a lot of fun with this one, and I was surprised by how little time it took me. There are like a couple weird spots in this recording though, and that was one of them where it just suddenly like teleported. My recording froze a couple times, so that happened. So right now I was looking at kind of a reference image of how to digitally paint a forest. I'm not sure who it was by. If I can find it, I'll link it in the description. But having this kind of like fading into the background, rough gradient thing seemed like a good place to start in a lot of tutorials that I was seeing. And because there was this overall green tinge to everything, the tutorial I was looking at had a blue tinge, but I didn't really want it because I felt like that gave it a bit more of a spooky vibe, and I wanted this to be a little bit more like serene and relaxed and, like a little baby fox would be exploring around. So I actually gave all of the trees and the bark and stuff, I gave it a greenish tint, kind of to signify that it was like alive and also like not threatening, and to make the palette more cohesive overall. I'm also doing these trees further back grayer because the one thing I know about perspective and color is that the farther something is away, the more color it loses, and that's why mountains in the distance are less colored than the mountains you see in front of you, I guess. It was kind of a hard thing to grasp, and this forest ended up looking kind of spooky anyway before I added the leaves, but that's just because trees are kind of spooky in general. The tree bark, I was having a hard time deciding how much detail I wanted to put into it, and I started out trying to make it look like tree bark, but it turns out to look kind of like scales. I don't necessarily hate the way this looks, but I don't particularly like it either. It felt too detailed, but still not looking correct. So I do some basic blending out here, and I'm planning on doing more of the traditional bark scales on it. But I just couldn't figure out a way to do it that I really liked, that I felt like was time efficient, so I just sort of left it like this, which I think is an okay simplification of what tree bark actually looks like. It still gives you the impression of wood grain and stuff, so I'm hoping that still came across okay. And in the background, I don't do all of the trees with the definition because obviously the ones that are further away, you're not going to see that definition on them, and so having them just be sort of one color adds to the illusion that they are further away. So I basically only do it on the trees that are kind of up close-ish. But the trees are on, I think, 4 planes of distance, so I tried to reflect that in their size, their color, their detail. I'm starting to do these little foliage pieces here, and I eventually go back and get rid of them, and I kind of regret it a little bit because This has like a lot of personality, I think, a lot of variety in the shape of the leaves and stuff like that. I did it using like a pastel-y pencil, and I do change to something. It looks a little bit more generic, so I think maybe I should have done a combination of the both. Here I am trying the river for the first time. I do eventually get rid of this version of the river because I don't like it. I was having a hard time really distinguishing the edges of the river as well as making it look kind of calm and still. This version ended up looking kind of like water, but it looked like water that was moving very rapidly, almost like a wave, because it kind of has a concave shape to the strokes that I'm doing, instead of like a more traditionally horizontal shape that we see in still water, in mostly still water, I suppose. And then I just add this like light color on top of it, and that doesn't make it look any better, so I scrap it and I decide I want to define the edges of the river a little bit more before I jump right in with coloring it, because it's defined in the sketch, but it wasn't defined in the colors. So I do another couple of these bushes, and I do this thing in the background, and I'm not really sure why I did it. Because thinking about it logically, I can't imagine what like this big brush thing in the distance is, but I saw it in a lot of foresty references, like drawing references that I was looking up, and I can't tell what it is. Like, is it bushes? Is it, I don't know, hedges? It's a very strange thing, and I don't really know why it's there, but I don't hate it, and it contributes to the look of like things in a foreground, things in a background. So if I were to do this again, I'm not sure if I would put that in there, but it is like a good separator for the foreground and background things, and adds to the illusion of distance. I don't know, I just saw it in a lot of things, and I'm not sure exactly what it's supposed to represent. These bushes I was having a little bit of trouble with, and I think ultimately they're the ones that I'm most okay that I got rid of. This is a dead log. I initially start with it being like a much more reddy brown color than the rest of the trees because I want it to look dead. But then I realized it's kind of standing out just so much. So I do change the color of that to like a bit more of a greeny color, but it's still more brown than the rest of the tree trunks. So that kind of makes it look dead but still part of the scene. Another thing about that tree trunk is that it was kind of an accident. Initially, I was drawing that little piece of wood there, the log that's over the river. I was drawing it as one of the roots of the tree, and just by happenstance a line went wrong here or there, wrong, quote unquote, and it turned out looking like this really cool broken log thing, and I thought, wow, that's really neat, I could put that over the river. Here I am trying again with the river, and this one goes better and worse. I try a bunch of stuff, and I was looking at another tutorial that said to use the smudge tool, and normally I'm like kinda trusting, I guess, with these tutorials, but a lot of them are from a time before Photoshop 2019, which is the version that I have right now. So the smudge tool might have worked differently a couple years ago than it did now, because they said to have it on at least 50% strength, but 50% strength for me just like completely smudged it. So I keep having to go back over with a dark color because the edges of the river are supposed to be darker. They're closer to land, so there's less light shining off the top of it. I keep having to go back over it with that dark color, and eventually I go for an even darker color and hope that that might blend out a little bit better. And it does. But it's still not quite the look I want. It's a little bit too smooth, so I start trying to chop it up a little bit, and it works to an extent, but it's not exactly what I want. So I go back in again with that dark color because I'm still trying to like differentiate it from the mid-tone, and it's still not quite working. I keep removing the crawling ants to see what it looks like, and eventually I go in with a mixer brush with a really low mix level. And I'm actually happy with how that turned out. It looked a bit more flowy. And I add all of these white shines on top, which really, really brought it together. I think it looks fantastic. Just like such a little thing there at the end, adding all those little white spots definitely brought it to a whole nother level of looking like water, which was just fantastic. I'm trying to add like a grassy texture in now. I kind of scrap it because at the moment it kind of feels like I'm trying to draw every blade of grass, which is of course like unsustainable completely. So I do try something a little bit different with that. I'm using a pastel brush for the foliage. So I'm doing the foliage now with like a pastel-y kind of brush, and I decide that I don't love it because there's like something about the way it's doing the foliage that's throwing me off a little bit, and it might be because like the quote-unquote leaves just look too small, and of course like the light is coming from the front of the drawing, so it looks backlit. But I do find a Photoshop foliage brush, and here's where I kind of run into one of my problems. I think the blue that I used for the darkest shading is just a touch too saturated. It's just a bit much. So it kind of overwhelms the drawing a little bit for quite a while until I add a like shading overlay, which I think balances everything out a little bit more. But I do think that blue tone is just like way too saturated. And I see it's way too saturated, so I'm trying to balance it out somehow by changing the hue shifting the trees and stuff. And then I'm doing more foliage on the trees in the back, but I realize if I start big with that blue color, it has no choice but to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I didn't want it to be like too overwhelming. So and I also desaturate those a little bit to push them to the back and shrink them down so they look a little bit less overwhelming. I try doing this like misty, foggy kind of thing, and I think it looks good, but it changes the feeling of the drawing in a way that I wasn't really liking. So I remove it and I move on to the grass. I use like a really chalky, pastel-y kind of brush because I want it to have a lot of texture. And then I used a textured blender, not the wet blender, because I was kind of looking for something different, something a little bit scratchier looking, I suppose. And I'm just trying to make it look like there are different tones in the grass here. And then adding little, accent pieces. I'm not sure like if I went overboard or underboard with the underboard? I don't know if that's a saying. Underboard with the little pieces of grass. But some of them I felt were standing out a bit strongly, so I took a low opacity eraser and, went over them a bit to just sort of make them a bit more subtle. And then I was trying to add reflections in the water because obviously at least the log was going to have a reflection. So I tried flipping it first, then I'm like, something about this just doesn't look right. And it's because you wouldn't be able to see the open face of the log from the bottom of it, obviously. So I tried again and I just sort of like shifted ever so slightly so you can't see that. And the only other parts that I felt like would really be reflecting in the water would be the tree branches, so I sort of make them subtly reflect with that blue color, because reflections are darker than the actual color. This is another one of those weird little glitchy moments. The thing with this is I actually went out to get ice cream in between, drawing this and drawing the fox, so I was drawing and I wasn't recording, and then I noticed. So unfortunately, you didn't get to see me draw the little fox, but you got to see me blend out his little colors. So now I'm adding that dark overlay I was talking about. I'm using a dark blue and just sort of backlighting everything because the sun is like coming straight down the path of the river in my opinion. That's where I'm seeing the light coming from, sort of from that like smoky, distant sunrise sort of thing, which is why I thought the fog would look good, and it does. It's just, I don't know, it loses some of the stuff in the background that I was really happy with. So I do try it again, but in the end I decided not to use it. I'm still debating whether or not I should have. And this is again where I run into a bit of a problem with that really saturated blue I used under the foliage. Foliage? I can't say that word. And I do also kind of regret this. I didn't end up adding a highlight overlay to the trees and stuff, just because I couldn't get it in a way that I felt was really comfortable. But I feel like it would have added just like a little something extra that I can't really pin down. But I'm trying at the moment to make the shading look more dappled because it's under the leaves of the tree. And I do kind of do something like that on the log because I think the bushes already have a bit of a dappling effect on them. And I add like a sort of sunny washed out overlay on one end because I thought that maybe contributed to the early morning look of it. Yeah, see, here I am dappling on the log a little bit. Not sure how successful it was. It added some more texture to the log, which is always a good thing, right? And I think about this overlay and I'm kind of like, I'm not sure about that. So I go through and I actually decide to change it from an overlay layer to a soft light layer. See, I'm actually really okay with the way that fog looks, but I don't know. Maybe I'll go back and add it in my spare time. But I do change this overlay layer into more of a soft light layer because I felt like the overlay layer was maybe a little bit intense, especially for it being kind of early. So it's a little bit softer, a little bit less, intense. And I'm thinking, well, what if I make it a night scene? But I don't like that nearly as much. So this is the finished piece. I'm really proud of how it turned out. I don't usually draw backgrounds, so this was incredibly unusual for me, but I hoped you like it. I hope you liked this speed draw, and I hope you have a wonderful day and all that jazz.